Hello, everyone, and welcome to the First Church of Permaculture. It's Sunday, August 14th, and we'll be kicking off Plant Power Month with a discussion of the natural abundance that we can often find just growing around us in the wild. And that's one of the reasons why we've probably always had this sense that plants were kind of sacred and cool. They key us in to paying attention to that natural abundance around us. And because of that, I think that that plants have often been a metaphor for some of our strongest emotions and experiences. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like a melody that's sweetly played in tune. As fair thou art, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, though all the seas can dry, though the seas can dry, my love, and the rocks melt with the sun, and I shall love thee still, my dear, though the sands of time shall run, and fare thee well, my bonny lass, and fare thee well a while, and I shall love thee still, my dear, though 'twere 10,000 miles. Though it were 10,000 miles, my love, though it were 10,000 miles, and I shall love thee still, my dear, though it were 10,000 miles. Oh, well, thanks for listening to me sing, y'all. It's fun to bring music and art and culture into this whole permaculture thing. You know, when I was getting into permaculture, that's something that one of my co permaculturists, Joss, said to me is um, that we need more culture in permaculture. So I have always agreed with that. Well, as we're getting started today with Plant Power Month and all of the cool wild abundance and plants that we find all around us, does anyone have any thoughts or anything to bring in on that topic as we're getting started today? Anything to share about it?
Yeah, I'm really excited to learn more about this. I'm a big fan of cramscaping, just jamming everything in there and seeing how it works out. So like learning to do it more intentionally so that the plants create more of a functional system is something I definitely want to master.
Yeah, in our last class, we were talking about how basically easy some of this permaculture stuff can be in a way. There's one sort of foolproof for anybody who's watching this. We're going to a big topic today is going to be like this vision. One of the first visions of permaculture, really. Bill Molson said that he had the first initial glimpse of what permaculture was when he was living and studying with some indigenous society. And so we're already talking about a forest that was probably somewhat managed for abundance. And it was just a super abundant ecosystem. And he thought, why do we make things like cornfields and fields of wheat when a system like this is just many times more productive and more abundant? Why don't we design food systems like this? And that was really one of the first ideas about permaculture. So today we're going to be talking about kind of that idea that there are these wild edible ecosystems that just kind of occur in nature in a lot of different places. And if we want to try to reduce the amount of work we're doing in landscaping and our landscapes and increase the amount of abundance and productivity and usefulness of them, then these are our best teachers. Nature can be the teacher. So it's a really pretty cool idea. And there's one foolproof way to do this. You just take a bunch of plants that, as Alicia said, cramscaping, right? Just cram a bunch of species into a small area. If you put in like 30 species into an area, and then assume that a few weedy species are going to come in as well, then probably, hopefully, you've given nature enough material, enough players to work with to create a community that will be stable. By the way, that's kind of, that number I just threw out there is kind of a best practice, an evolving best practice in the permaculture community, and what I consider the most cutting edge parts of it. So that's a number that Jeff Lawton has used. It's a number that Eric Tonesmeyer and Jonathan Bates have used as well. So you imagine you take like a 20 by 20 plot or something like that, or a 20 by 30 plot, and you try to fit 30 species into that, and you try to fill it up as much as you can, randomize things in there so things are a bit spread out. And what you end up with might not be like what you wanted necessarily, but it's probably going to be filled with some useful stuff. Of course, that also brings us to what I always call the first rule of guilds. And by the way, when we're talking about this topic, that's what we're really talking about, is what permaculturists have begun calling guilds. And really, this concept is also used in regular ecology too. So a guild is kind of a designed human plant community. So we're trying to copy naturally somewhat stable plant communities, and that's what we call a guild. So we say really that, so we also have this other term, polyculture. And then we have this term guild. Hey, can someone tell me what you think the difference is between a polyculture and a guild? And if you feel like saying it, you can kind of define both of us for us. I muted everybody, so if you're going to talk, you'll have to unmute.
Don't you ever mute me. It seems like a polyculture is just an assortment of plants, just any old random assortment. That's my take. And a guild is more intentional and more, there's some design to it instead of just, so the randomness factor, shall we say. Is that anything close to right?
It sounds about right to me. Yeah, and there's still some disagreement within the permaculture community and with different groups of people about some of this. But I think you kind of hit on the big thing. A polyculture just means more than one plant in a garden or a bed or an area. So that's opposed to a monoculture. So when we talk about monoculture, we're talking about like those big fields of corn or big fields of wheat we see. When we talk about a polyculture, we're talking about maybe 2 plants or 3 plants. A common example of a polyculture is the famous three sisters, right? Which is corn, beans, and squash grown together. So that's one kind of a polyculture. A guild then is a little bit different. And to me, the key idea of a guild is that we're talking about something that, if the whole idea is that we're imitating a natural, stable plant community, then that means kind of the key defining characteristic of a guild as opposed to a polyculture is that we have some expectation that it's going to be like a natural plant community, right? If the idea of a guild is that we're imitating natural plant communities, then we have an expectation that's going to be like a natural plant community, which means we kind of expect it to be kind of stable over a long period of time, instead of something that just like that we have to put in a ton of work in order to keep it going, right? So that stability is a big thing. So to me, so that's how I define it. And so there's, as an example, some people will use the Three Sisters planting as an example of a guild because they do cooperate together. But in most cases, if you just like have a Three Sisters garden, you do have to maintain it. You have to come back and replant it every year. So to me, it's more like what I would call polyculture or an interplanting. But we'll talk more about these if anyone feels like joining the class starting Monday night. It'll be Monday, Wednesdays, 2 weeks in a row from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. And we'll go into all these differences, the differences between things like polycultures, companion plantings, intercropping, guilds, forest gardens, edible ecosystems, all that stuff. We're going to kind of touch on some of that today, but those are the big things. So when we're talking about a guild, then the biggest defining characteristic to me is that stability, which is why I always give the first rule of guilds, which is that we have three kinds of guilds. Guilds that are designed to keep grasses and resident vegetation weeds out of them. Guilds, that's the first type, right? They're specifically designed so that grass encroachment or other weeds, like sometimes if you're in a shadier area, the main dominant weed might be something like violets, right? And so you'd be designing that garden to keep violets out in that case. The second type is a garden or a guild designed to thrive with whatever that resident vegetation is. So if you're in a sunny area with enough sun, enough water, and enough soil fertility, 100% of the time, and 100% of terrestrial ecosystems, the dominant plant type are grasses. Grasses just dominate in that phase of succession where you have like full sun, good water, and good fertility. It's going to be grasses, right? So those are exactly the kinds of places where we usually would have a productive vegetable gardens, right? That's why so many people, like one of their biggest jobs is keeping grasses and grass out of the garden. Once grasses invade the garden, right, a lot of times that garden is done. The only thing we can do is come back next year, till it all up and start all over again. That garden is done. And so a lot of times people will plant, like copy a guild out of a book or something like that, and they'll plant it out. I've just seen this so many times. And then the grasses move in or whatever, usually it's grasses, because usually people plant a fruit tree guild in a good sunny spot with good fertility, make sure it has good water, right? And so if they haven't designed to keep water out or grasses out, the grasses move in and take it over. And a year later, they've got a garden that's basically a fruit tree with some grasses, and maybe if one or two of their plants could survive with the grasses, then those were there too. So that gives us a third type of plant. So either they're designed to keep grasses and weeds out. 2, they're designed to thrive with grasses and weeds. Or 3, they're designed to fail. If we have the expectation that they're going to be easy to maintain and stable and be like guilds, and we haven't designed for one of those first 2, then we're usually going to be disappointed with that guild. Just leave a little space in case people have thoughts or comments or questions about that.
That's right where I'm at. Like, I'm obsessing about fortress plantings for two reasons. One, because last fall I did some installs of things that definitely need fortress plantings. And then I had poison ivy coming through my back fence this summer. And so I threw together some stuff that I now recognize was a fortress planting. This is how I usually do things. I kind of start in the middle and make a mess and then work my way back out. So that's...
Right. Well, what we talked about at the beginning of this, like the foolproof way is you take is cram spacing. By the way, I'm not sure I've heard that term, Alicia. I love it. You take a bunch of plants, 30 plants usually is, like I said, the best practice. You cram them all in there, and hopefully you've given nature enough stuff to work with that nature will figure it out. Then, you know, if we haven't thought about how we define that space with things like fortress plants, then you know, we have to go back and fiddle afterwards. And then we see, oh, well, these plants right here repelled the grasses, and these plants here got killed by the grasses. Oh, okay, how do I tweak that, play with that? You know, a lot of people, like at least one really common plant in a lot of permaculture guilds is comfrey. Comfrey is great at being allelopathic to grasses. In a lot of gardens, comfrey will kick the grasses' butt. It's usually not if there's just one alone. You know, if you just have one comfrey plant, the grass is going to overrun it. But if you've got this clump of comfrey, it's more likely that comfrey will invade the grass than it is that the grass will overrun the comfrey. So yeah, we'll kind of look at some models for things like that today. Hey, you know, I see Joey just, Pamela just unmuted. Maybe she's got a comment.
I wanted to say that Edible Acres has a series of dealing with comfrey in a long line between their land they steward and the land their neighbors steward. And there's follow-up videos. Of course, they have tons of videos. I don't know what the title of it is, but it absolutely demonstrates this. And at one point in time, this big long line of comfrey is huge and it's falling over, you know how it does. And so they go along and they cut it and they plan, I think they planted, well, anyway, the grass is just dead under there. But they planted it like about once every foot or so. I mean, they really went at it. But it just leaves no doubt in your mind. Where I am, lemon balm is doing that. And it's amazing. And that wasn't planned, but it is very, very happy in many places on the land we steward. And then I realized, oh, look what it's doing. Plus it's overwhelming a very, very pesky weed that we have here, which is called shiny geranium. And it's no match for a comfrey. It's like, okay, guys.
Yeah, a lot of, you know, and this idea of fortress plantings really works on a lot of different types of runnering weedy plants. Though a lot of times what we end up with, the dominant ground cover species that you have in a lot of different ecosystems, like I said, if you've got enough sun, enough water, and enough fertility, it's going to be grasses. You know, grasses are going to be the monster. And if you're in a little more shade, you have more acidic soil, it might be something like, like violets are really common or something like that. But they're also, usually the dominant player is going to be something that spreads by runner again, kind of like grasses, and forms thick clumps and stuff like that. And if there's enough sun and fertility, comfrey, if you have a thick line of it, like Sean at Edible Acres does, then that will do that job. Another one that's really great at it is sunchoke. So if you want a native plant option, Jerusalem artichokes will absolutely form a fortress planting like that will keep the grasses from encroaching into the garden. And if you can build, you know, that wall, and I personally like a multi-species approach. So I will usually do, I will usually cramscape a fortress planting of several different species all together, knowing that they're going to form kind of a fortress gill that's going to keep grasses out over the long season. So they're going to be things that thrive in the spring, like bulbs. A lot of bulbs have that allelopathy to grass because they're natural grassland plants. So they have evolved to be able to keep grass roots away from them. So walking onions and daffodils will have that kind of power. Fennel bulb will have that kind of power, and we just cram them all in there, and hopefully you'll have this good, solid fortress that prevents those weeds.
Oh, well, how close together do you put walking onions to do that?
Well, if they were the only player in the guild, they would have to be crammed really tight. Like they'd have to be almost as tight as they are when they come in as their own thick kind of because they spread by dividing, right? So one walking onion will turn into a huge walking onion clump. And at that point, that is very resistant to grass encroachment. But I usually intersperse them and put them in with other things like that comfrey, like sorrel maybe would be another one, or fennel and things like this, and make that kind of a guild with them in there. And then they just kind of fill in the spaces in between these other plants and make sure that like barrier is as complete as it possibly can be. It's never going to be perfect. There's going to be some grass runners that get in through there and find their way, but it's going to be way less, and it's going to be way more manageable.
Hey, Mike, how do you feel about irises as a fortress plant? They seem to form like a nice clump that's pretty resistant to things intruding.
There you go. Then, and here's the thing with all these. The real thing, and here we have Robin on here who has like a master's degree in a biological field. And so people who are more familiar with the science on plants and the science of biology know that scientifically speaking, there's really no such thing as a fortress plant. You're not going to find it in any science textbook. What we're really talking about is kind of an engineering, an ecological engineering kind of term of art. And the reason why I'm saying this, Sandy, is that there's no one plant that we can say, this is a fortress plant. It keeps grasses and weeds out of the garden. What we're really talking about is imitating an actual scientific concept, which is succession. Because we have all seen fortress plants in ecosystems around us. Like if you're driving down the road, you're driving down the highway, and you see this green wall of vegetation, of forest, and then there's going to be like, a bunch of different, usually in my region, that forest edge is going to be populated by a bunch of brambles, and it's going to be populated by maybe pokeweed and evening dame's rocket and plants like that. Maybe there'd still be some old spring bulbs in there from when it used to be a farm or something. But then you get to that green wall and you look beyond it and the grasses stop, It's like grassland, and there's this wall of succession where those plants literally evolved to repel grasses, to colonize grasses and push forward succession. So what we're trying to do is imitate that. It's going to be different on all different spaces. It's going to depend on how much sun you have, how much water you have. I can give you a big list of plants and say, try these, right? This is what we're doing. If you've observed irises doing that on your amount of, irises are naturally kind of a wetland plant. You have kind of a wet site. It would make sense that they would have that superpower on your site. If you've got a dry site, you might look for some of the Mediterranean herbs that are known to do that same thing in drier sites.
Well, as I'm rather mushy, I'm going to try. The irises do fine for me in the front, so I'm going to try them in the back. And also maybe try some daylilies because they are pretty flexible and they form that big clump. We'll see. The deer will eat some. Deer got to eat too. I hate them. They got to eat.
Daylilies do the job in a lot of places, like a lot of places around me too. It's that same thing. You have, rampant grassland, and then you have, the thicket of a forest edge coming out, and that can be dominated in a lot of places. If you've got daylilies, they'll obviously form a big thicket there.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And this is kind of a cool thing, right? We're really talking about getting out there, looking at what's happening in our own ecosystems, and just bringing natural wisdom home into our own landscapes. It's going to be a little different at all of our homes, but we can always find some of these ideas. Hey, we're going to start talking about. I'd love to show you some of these kinds of ideas, and we can look at some of these cool, naturally occurring wild ecosystems as we go. And as we're doing that, I also know that Joey's on here. I saw him join a bit back ago, and I know that he's a rampant forager as well. And this whole topic is why, for over the last 15 years, this transformative adventures community of different teachers and my students who have gone on to become teachers, we often say, "Oh, awesome! I'm glad," and we often say that the first step, the first adventure in becoming a really good gardener, is to become a forager. Because when we're foraging, we're going out and we're visiting the real teacher. Those natural edible ecosystems are just going to be way better teacher than I could ever be. The natural edible ecosystems in your region, if you find some of those. Though, if you've visited some like that, I would love to hear about them as we go. I'm going to show you some.
Where I live, also, I forgot, how could I have not have mentioned, nettles will act as a fortress plant. Iris kind of, it tries, but it doesn't really make it. But this is a Mediterranean climate, Portland, Oregon. And the grass kind of slows down around the iris, but it's there. But you can spot it easily and remove it.
Yeah. Think about their stage in a natural ecosystem. A lot of bulbs actually evolve as grassland kind of plants. So they've got enough, they've also got usually really tiny roots, right? So usually what they're doing is pumping some poisons that will repel the roots of other plants, especially grass. They have evolved, if they want to live, then usually they have to be able to keep a little bit of a space around them from grasses. And if you go out into wild ecosystems and you find a clump of something like that that's surviving, in my region, it's really common to go out and find big swaths of daffodils. And you look between a clump of daffodils, inside there is going to be like dead grasses. Yes, I can. Put the presentation in the chat.
Thank you.
Yep. Give me just a second to do that. But yeah, so that's something you can observe in a lot of places, but it doesn't have as strong of an effect as some of those plants that kind of, creep out into grassland from the forest edge and start converting that forest edge into a more productive forest or old field kind of ecosystem. Let's see if that works for us. Here we go.
It's really hard for me to access the chat. So if it's possible, maybe after church is over, if you could put that in the comments.
Of course.
Thanks. Yeah.
There it goes. Okay, it should be in there.
Thank you.
This is really interesting. I think what you're calling fortress plants is what I think of as edge plants, because I also do some foraging and wildcrafting, and especially along logging roads of areas in various stages of deforestation, a lot of grass does try to get going, and the things that line the edges there and grow intermixed with the grass or outcompete it, I think those are the forest plants, and I've just never thought of them that way before. My list of fortress plants just got a lot longer. This is really cool.
Yeah, that's it. Those are exactly the things we're looking for. You know, find some spots that are similar to your garden, similar to your soils, your level of sun, and see what nature is doing to convert it from grassland into a slightly more productive type of system. You know, what you'll usually get, this is why in permaculture we call it edge effect. The hedges between things are usually the most productive ecosystem. So a lot of times, you know, we'll have this, like, this blue line represents the edge of a forest, you know, and out here, you know, we have grassland, and in the grassland, it's like mostly, you know, there are very few plants that can tolerate that, you know. So out here in the grassland, it's mostly going to be like grass, dandelions, and hawkweed, maybe things like that, things that can survive with grasses. Now, I'm going to show you. There's really a ton. Really, we could create a whole edible grassland, edible meadow ecosystem with like 30 different species. I'm going to show you some cool examples of that. But usually, it's just not as dense. And, you know, it's great if you're a cow or if you have cattle. Cows can eat it, but we usually can't unless we're running them through a cow first. So for us, you know, we need something a little more diverse. And the edge between the forest, the dark blue, you know, the dark shady forest back here, and that grassland will start to have, you know, these little different things in here. It's going to be a lot more diverse. There still is probably some, you know, grass going into there, and it's, you know, and at a certain point, the grasses tend to really peter out. In this little forest edge area, we start to get forest species. We get these pioneer species that really push out through there. Lots of brambles, vines, like Very said, and some larger, more productive plants. It turns out a lot of our garden vegetable type plants, and especially our perennial vegetables, are species from this area. We were talking earlier about sunchokes. A lot of times in my region, it'll be sunchokes, and you'll have this big line of sunchokes coming out through there. There's no grasses getting in through those sunchokes. And those sunchokes can be really productive kinds of systems. So, you know, this is really what we're talking about, is recreating and finding this edge. And when we're making a little garden area, we're kind of trying to imitate that same thing a little bit. It's never going to be perfect, you know, just like this is, right? There's still grasses coming through there, but it's going to be much more manageable and easier, is my experience.
So in the Pacific Northwest, in a Mediterranean climate, one thing, oh my God, oregano, oh my God, oregano, oh my God, oh my God. And oh, how can I be spacing out the name? Lavender as a close second, but the oregano forms this mat. It's, oh my God. It's pretty spectacular.
Especially if you eat it and trim it, just like grasses, it will form a really dense mat over a couple of years of time. Mm-hmm. And especially if it's a little bit dry, boy, that can be really a powerful fortress plant in a lot of areas. In fact, we'll kind of scroll ahead here. And where do I got this? Oh shoot. You know what? I might not have put it in there yet. Here's what we'll do. We'll give me just a second here. Oh, there it is. So yeah, this is a picture from Provence. And we talk about herbes du Provence because en Provence, you can find big fields in the hillsides that are fairly, is important. It's pretty sandy soil. You know, it's really silty, but it's well-draining soil. It's usually in the hillside, so the water doesn't get into it very well. In these conditions, these Mediterranean herbs absolutely dominate and kick ass. And you can see there's still some grasses creeping around in there, here and there, but it can be dominated by these plants. And you can just find places like this where they're just absolutely rich with thyme, rosemary, savory, marjoram, and lavender. I really do think the best one, like these other, if you want to create a polyculture for a Mediterranean or dry climate that will work really well like this, then these are just absolutely kind of dominant here. Along a lot of the West Coast, from especially, you know, kind of mid-California, all the way north, as far north as I've been, you can also find in similar situations, fennel can be really, can be included in here too. Fennel is very strongly allelopathic to pretty much everything, and including grasses. And remember, we can perennialize bulbing fennel to get nice big bulbs of fennel as well. So that's kind of a magic technique to me, because I love eating fennel, but in my climate, it's really difficult to grow a good sized fennel bulb because it's just not enough time. But if you grow them this kind of a clump, you can get a big clump of like 10 fennel bulbs off one plant. They'll be big grocery store size fennel bulbs, and it acts as a very strong fortress plant. So this is pretty much exactly what Pamela was just talking about. And we can totally imitate this, especially if we're in a drier climate. Now, if you're not in a drier climate, I still use this. And here's how I use it. Here's the grass, right? Here's the lawn area. Here's the grass I want to keep out of the garden. Well, probably in a wetter climate, grass is going to kick the butt of these things. So these are not going to stand. Like if Provence was a wetter climate and not a Mediterranean climate, that would all be grassland and not herbe de Provence. So I need to imitate a really dry kind of climate area. So maybe I can put some urbanite here, some recycled concrete blocks, and maybe fill this up with some woody mulch, like a Hugelkultur kind of thing. And now I plant my oregano on here and keep it nice and trim. So I've got something that looks like a trim box hedge growing on top of there. Now, this is an environment that's going to be really, it's going to be, I basically recreated Provence on top of in my wet my wet garden, right? So now this is going to be more resistant to those grasses. So those are those trimmed oregano hedges that look like box hedges at Lily House. They're actually made from oregano. They look really formal. People see them and think they're like English box, right? They're actually oregano. I'm recreating that here at my new garden as well, just because this, oregano in that kind of a circumstance just really kicks butt.
And if you let fennel go to seed, if you just really, really love that fennel plant and it gets huge, it will carpet areas around it with little tiny fennel plants. That the seeds, it's amazing. You'll have all the fennel you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you're in a drier climate, and you could think about that here, while we're talking about Mediterranean climates, I'd love to show you another one like that. So this is actually in Northern California. And so this is one we visited. This is a big field that's actually a really cool lagoon for treating human manure. And, or rather I should say, this is kind of the overflow field next to it. So this particular part of it is not so bad, but this is an area, it's Mediterranean climate still. It's not quite the manure, so it's not completely super fertility, but it's got pretty decent fertility, pretty decent water, and still it has this polyculture of just naturally, it's been seeded over a long period of time, and what has dominated is this really interesting, natural, almost entirely edible polyculture. Again, you can see grasses, but right here in the foreground, it's all radishes. So all those white flowers that you see, that's a big field of radishes. Now, the radishes themselves have too much competition to grow big size, good quality radish roots. But the pods are edible, right? The pods are a great little vegetable called rat tails. Sometimes I actually prefer to eat the radish pods than to eat the actual radishes. They're spicy. They're like spicy green beans. Anybody else eat them? And I love pickling them too. And so it has a lot of dominance of radishes. And then it also is just filled with fennel again. So it's a huge quantity of radishes, a huge quantity of fennel. And then on the right here, you can see some small fennel plants coming in with mints. So mints, in the left picture too, in the bottom, you can see or a pink haze through it. That pink haze is all peppermint. So here we have a natural polyculture occurring in the Mediterranean climate in the United States. It's a huge field chock full of food that you can't eat because it's a manure lagoon. But still, we could imitate this kind of system in the same climate and then maybe start to add to it in some smart ways too. I bet that marjoram and lavender and thyme would do very well in a system like this as well. Oh, milkweed for sure. Hey, speaking of milkweed, here's another one of this one is in southern Michigan, right on the Indiana-Michigan border. And what you see here is a really cool, super dense polyculture. And the flowers, the purple flowers in there, look like they're just regular sweet peas. But has anyone ever eaten tuberous sweet pea? This is an amazing perennial vegetable that can become a thick, weedy mass in a lot of places. And even the peas themselves on the sweet pea have a bit less of the chemical that binds nutrients that can give you lathyrism, which is why we don't eat sweet peas, because they can make you sick if you eat too many of them. Tuberous sweet pea has less of that, and there's a tiny amount of it in the tuber too. It's a really great quality sweet potato kind of vegetable, and so this is, and it's a perennial. So this is a perennial sweet pea, and as you can see, it's just absolutely thick in here, and then it has milkweed. Milkweed is like 5 amazing vegetables together. So we can eat the milkweed shoots when they first come up in the spring, kind of like asparagus. That's my least favorite part of it. Then when it starts to flower, we can take those florets, and I like that a lot better. You can cook those florets in a stir fry or something like that. I love to tempura them. They're one of my favorite wild tempuras. That's my favorite way to eat those. Even the flowers themselves, once they flower, can be a really cool kind of firework looking tempura. And then my favorite part are the pods. The milkweed pods, before they get the pre-silk in there, before it's called pre-silk inside, once that turns to silk and seeds, you can't eat that. But before those seeds come in, it's an amazing vegetable. I love to dredge them in some flour and cayenne pepper, something nice and spicy, and sea salt, and then fry them. And they're like jalapeno poppers. They're amazing. They're like nature's jalapeno poppers. Anybody else have uses for milkweed?
Monarch hosts.
100%. So not only is it something that we can take advantage of as well, and we're eating parts that don't interfere with the monarch life cycle. So us making use of the milkweed as a vegetable does not compete with the monarch. So this is a great plant to plant in an edible ecosystem. Great for us, great for monarchs.
As long as you are not harvesting all the shoots or all those pods. Yeah.
Right. If you harvest all of them, then you no longer have milkweed.
Right.
Can you
Oh,
go-
I was just going to mention the cordage too. Actually, my neighbor said that he took a class where they use the milkweed stalks to make cordage, kind of similar to what you would do with nettle too.
Oh, that's cool.
I have not heard that. Dogbane looks pretty similar to milkweed in some stages and is one of the best fiber plants. And I need to learn about the milkweed one. I've never heard anybody using it for that.
Can you
I
grow
bought-
milkweed from seed?
Yes.
I bought
Yes.
some milkweed and the rabbits ate it before I got it in the ground.
Yeah, I say it's yes, you can grow it from seed, but my experience is that it usually takes about 3 years before you have like a single viable plant that will then start spreading. So it's usually like 5 years before you have a stand of milkweed. Then it tends to be a pretty slow grower from seed, and require my experience and my biomes where I've lived. So, but a small piece of milkweed root, you find a milkweed plant this fall and you dig up that one plant, get as much of that root as you can, take it home and bury it. And next spring, you'll have a complete milkweed plant. By year 2, you'll probably have like 10 milkweed plants. They're going to be spreading. And by year 3, you've got tons extra to start harvesting. So it's one where, yes, you can grow it from seed. If you can find a friend who's got a milkweed stand who will let you dig up a portion of the root of one of them and take it home, that's the easiest way to establish a good stand of milkweed.
Okay.
I would say from my experience with the Native Plant Initiative, we actually grow tons of milkweed from seed, but we do start it in the greenhouse. I think we had probably 8 or 10 different varieties that were kind of more adapted to our region, because we have a fellow grad student is doing a research project where she's looking at which milkweeds the monarchs prefer for laying eggs and things like that. So we have a ton of it growing out in the field that we started, and it actually grows really well. We started some from seed, the swamp milkweed and a bunch of them, and they're already flowering. So if you have the right conditions to start them in and maybe kind of baby them a little bit at the beginning, or just start them in a greenhouse, they actually really get pretty big and healthy with even the first or second year. I don't know about how well they reproduce or how long it takes them to do that out in the field. It might take a couple of years before you're going to get a big patch of them, but we've had pretty good success with just starting them from seed.
That's great to
All
hear.
the milkweed. Yeah, all the milkweed in our garden is from seed, and it's spreading very fast in just a sort of bare ground scenario. It doesn't always last forever in one place. So there was none in the garden when I arrived 4 years ago, and then we got a small stand last year of like 7 stalks, and now there's 30 plus this year.
Oh, good job.
It just
Yeah.
brought itself in.
Once
And
once
actually,
once you've got like one established plant, I mean, it loves to spread really easily by runner once you got that established plant. This discussion we're having might be because I'm a slightly lazier gardener. So it's a matter of like, so if you baby those initial plants, make sure they're taken care of. It's it's definitely a great easy to grow plant. Where I will tend to lose them is in that stage when they're still small plants, as I just don't baby them enough then. But if I go and I get a cutting from someone, a root, then boom, I've got an instant stand usually. So
See, I like playing with seeds in the spring, early, when there's nothing else to do plant wise. So I do a lot of winter sowing in plastic milk jugs because it keeps them out of the dump and I can use them for 10 years before they're so trashed.
There,
Looks
there are
good.
Yeah.
entire Facebook groups dedicated to starting milkweed from seed. And a lot of them use the winter sowers. And then there's another group that uses ball jars, but I didn't look into that real deeply.
Oh, that's an idea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask some questions about the ecosystems like the one we're looking at?
Yeah, can I would love to just mention one more thing about this ecosystem, actually two more things about it. Two more things about it. The small creeping plant that you see in the foreground running around through it is actually a wild mint as well, American field mint. So there's a bunch of mint growing in, you can tell this is a pretty rich ecosystem with good water, good fertility. And in this case, these very vigorous later succession plants have formed a stand that are again out competing the grasses. So this might make another good model for something that's a lot more like, you can see some grasses still in there, but the grasses are not dominating. These larger, what we'll later call productive plants or producer plants are dominating it. And in the background, you can even see kind of an autumn olive coming in, showing that we could use this as a sort of forest garden edge kind of system as well. So this is a pretty darn neat little wild ecosystem. And I've visited it at least over 3 years, and every year it looked exactly the same.
Was anybody mowing it?
This section appeared to get mown. It's at a park. It's at a conservation area, but it's on the way into the conservation area, not in the actual conservation area. And I believe that overall, I think this probably gets like brush hogged once every few years. It's on a very low mow kind of regimen. Yeah, more questions about it, please.
So the meadow that looks like this that I visit in my area, and I was trying to see who was all growing in there, and it was milkweed and goldenrod and mugwort, lots of those. And then there were some more that I don't remember, but there was also a ton of vines, and that's always a constant curiosity that I have. So there was Virginia creeper coming up, and there was poison ivy seedlings, a good number of them. And I know they're not going to climb over and smother these perennials like they do shrubs, because they'll just go in between them and they'll fall down, and the perennials will come back up anyway. But they are going to take a good bit of space, and I guess there was a little bit of vetch, maybe not a ton. I would love to put some groundnuts in there. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll just throw them in there. I think we might get seeds. Actually, I think we have the groundnut that doesn't make seeds. So it would have to be tubers. But I mentioned earlier in the chat that I understand that camas bulbs and groundnut were extremely prolific staple foods that were grown in this kind of scenario, like a meadow or the grasslands or savannas that would also be grazed by grazers, but were managed by the indigenous folks for these staple foods. That some of these, the ones that you eat, the greens and things like that, might not have been the primary crops from such an ecosystem. But Pascal Baudère, do you know him? Yeah, so he's been posting a ton about wild seeds. So I bet we could get a ton of those from the radishes that you mentioned. And a forager friend of mine recently told me that he learned in one of his events that he stayed at with one of these professionals that do this for their livelihood, learned that all grasses are edible. And I don't know what that means yet, but that makes all your grasses one of these edible ecosystem options if we figure out how to do that.
Pamela loves to talk about that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, but I also learned that the guy, I kind of don't know what to make of this guy. you probably all seen, Stephen Gundry, how tomatoes have lectins. The last thing that I read of his, he said that wheatgrass has lectins rather. And I don't know if that means, I don't know exactly what the implications of that are, because I was totally excited thinking, well, they people like Sergei Butenko says, well, grass is edible. So if you'll never starve, you can eat your lawn. So I don't know where the truth lies. I mean, you can eat your lawn, but I don't know about these lectins.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, please.
So my experience with grasses, and I'd love to hear Joey mention this too, is that we can say that all grasses are edible. Now, practically speaking, that doesn't do a lot for me. I'm a very practical guy with all this. Like, I'm not out to fool myself. I'm not looking at so here's, this is a view of the wild edible ecosystem portion, kind of the wild edible meadow in my garden at Lily House. And so this is a super dense food kind of system. I mean, it's very high productivity. Multiple people who've been long-term farmers over the course of their lives have looked at this in a portion of the season and said, there's more food in a 10-foot by 10-foot area of this edible meadow growing wild than there is in my entire 1,000 square foot garden. And, so it's a super high density system. I'd be fooling myself to look at my lawn and pretend that had the same density of food as this, because I can't really eat it. There are some species, like I was big on grasses about 15 years ago. I went through a thing where I loved harvesting wild grass seeds, but you've got to, you don't want to eat too much of the chaff, because that has an anti-nutrient in it too, like lectins. And actually oats do too, by the way. And that's why you soak them. So you can soak that out. If you soak those or and germinate them or sprout them, that gets rid of that anti-nutrient. So there are ways of dealing with that. But most grasses are, later on next week, we can talk about some of the grasses like foxtail grass, like foxtail millet. A lot of the wild weedy grasses in a lot of places are as an annual grass that comes in, and people hate this stuff in their gardens. It's millet. It's a wild millet. It was brought here as food, and that millet actually has pretty darn big seeds. You can collect those seeds and you can grind them in a coffee press. And millet is really interesting one because it doesn't have much chaff. It's basically naturally hulless. So you can collect that foxtail millet, grind it in a coffee grinder, add it to bread. It adds a great kind of peanut buttery, wild quality to things like pancakes. I love that. There's some wild rye that will add a bit of a rye flavor, and they've got large enough seeds. But you still have to do something to get rid of the chaff. You got to process them. It's a lot of work. 5-finger grass, crabgrass that everybody hates, that actually has a starchy storage organ down at the bottom. That 5-finger part that gives it its name, the rootlet right where it connects to the ground, has a starchy storage organ, and that you can actually take and dry and pulverize and turn into flour too. You have to remove the chaff from that. All of these are things that I've experimented around with. I know Joey was saying he made pancakes or something from some wild grasses. So you can do that kind of thing. But it's pretty rare to find a stand of grasses that you can really honestly turn into a lot of food. So when we're talking about that, to me, a truly high value edible meadow or edible prairie ecosystem is going to be defined by the things that we actually can go out and use very easily as vegetables. Now, by the way, this is one of the second big topics I talk about, is what we call guild matrix. So the difference between a guild that's going to be just like we can say, oh, this is all edible stuff. And this is kind of like forager language, right? We have this idea of, there's like a meme out there that says like, how to speak forager. A forager says, this is one of my favorite vegetables. And that translates as, you can kind of eat this. And they can say, this is a good vegetable. And that means you can eat this if it's a famine. And then they can say, it's edible. That means you don't want to eat this. But if you're going to die, you might try it first. It's the same thing when we think about guilds, So a really high quality guild is going to be defined by a stable matrix of plants that are also extremely useful to us, like the ones I'm showing. You can look at this and see it's a huge quantity of dense with food. And we imitate that. We have something like this. That again, look at all the garlic in the foreground here. This is a super high density food producing kind of ecosystem based on a meadow. So we can be a little subjective, we can make a value judgment about how much we can actually use a particular edible ecosystem. All ecosystems are edible ecosystems, yes, but some are more edible than others.
Well, what you can do with grass is you can add it to green smoothies.
Yes.
And I've done that. And that's what Sergei Butenko was referring to. And as far as millet goes, even Stephen Gundry says that millet does not have lectins. So we're stocking up on millet here.
And millet, so I have a whole system that uses millet. So you've heard of chicken trackers, where you can use chickens to clear an area of vegetation and then plant it with a garden. And you can do sunchoke trackers. I've made sunchoke trackers where you plant sunchokes in an area. Over a couple of years, they take over and dominate to the point that there's nothing left but sunchokes. Then it's really easy to kill sunchokes. If you trim them once or twice a year, or you crimp them so that they bend and don't break, you will kill sunchokes really easily. So now you have made a spot that is mulched with sunchoke fibers. So it has mulch built right in. We could call this crimp mulch. You can make a crimp mulch garden with sunchokes and transition from sunchokes directly into a garden, plant right into that stuff. So, you can do that kind of thing. I've done the same thing with millet, because millet, foxtail millet, that just kind of grows as a weedy thing around here in a lot of cases. If you can encourage that to take over an area, it will actually very easily kill a lot of the runnering grasses. And it's an annual grass. So once it's gone, it's gone. So if you can establish other dominant vegetables in there before that millet comes back, you can millet tracker. And that foxtail millet has a pretty darn good grain. Yeah, I say that too. It's one of the more useful ones, but I had like a 500 square foot section dominated by foxtail millet doing this while I was doing this. And I kept wanting to harvest it. I didn't have time. I was really busy. My sister came over to harvest it, and she spent like an hour going over a 500 square foot bed of foxtail millet, and she just got like one bowl of millet. It would have made like, if you were just making millet out of it, it would have made like 3 servings, 3 bowls of millet. So it's not super high productivity, but if we ground that and turned it into flour or something, it's cool. It's not as useful as a big field of garlic. Speaking of, here's one. So I have found 3 places that were probably at one point farm fields in Southwest Michigan and Northern Indiana. And this is one, by the way, I was telling you earlier about that allelopathic quality of a lot of bulbs like garlic. And here we have a bunch of garlic plants growing wild. I've visited this field. There was an abandoned house at a corner in Michigan with like no other houses around. So this has not been tended. I've visited this over about 10 years and harvested from it. And it's been a stable, edible ecosystem for about that long. And if you look in here, you see you see some grasses, and you see a lot of garlic, and you see a lot of dead grasses in between. And this is because of the allelopathy of a huge dominant number of garlic. And the other plant that you see in here is a mint motherwort. And motherwort, mints are all allelopaths too. So we have this combined power of garlic and motherwort and probably some other things in the spring. And together they allow the garlic to flourish. And this produces nice size. Like I go to the farmer's market and see hardneck garlic that's this size. This is from that stand. This is right on my car, pulled it out of the field. And this is a long-term viable edible ecosystem over at least 10 years, producing tons of garlic with literally no human management. And probably I was the only person harvesting from this. Now, this is a lot more useful than getting a cup of millet. Like 500 square feet of this probably would have produced like 100 bulbs of garlic or more, probably like 500 bulbs of garlic. And it also jumped off across the street. So this is a section across the street, and you can see a lot of that looks like grasses. You see a mowed strip of grasses. That's all grass, because some guy who lives down the street mows it, keep it look nice. Because we got to mow our lawns. We're American. We got to mow that. But behind that, what you see is largely garlic fronds, and you see kind of bare, mulchy soil in between there, up in the foreground here, because that garlic and the motherwort together are making this kind of like a guild matrix. So together, those things, that's why I call a guild matrix, like that garlic, mint together, things like that. I can use both of those plants in huge quantities. That is super useful to me. That's way more useful to me than just saying, oh, well, you can eat your grasses. And the same thing is true with, like, look at that picture of the herbs of herb de Provence. That's a big field of stuff that I can go to, whole paycheck and pay like $6 for a little package of them. You could take that field and it'd be like $100,000 worth of stuff at whole paycheck, So that's a really high value edible ecosystem. And along the background here, there were more like autumn olive. It's not my favorite plant, but it does produce edible berries. It's a nitrogen fixer. There was like some crab apples. There was service berries through there. And so you could see this could be a model for a forest edge edible ecosystem. And it's just filled with food growing wild over 10 years. So this is exactly the kind of system that I took and replicated at home. I know that garlic works in a situation like that. So here's mine at home. You can see tons of garlic growing in it. And by the way, I don't replant the garlic. I take some of the bulbils off the top, or I let the bulbils fall off. I harvest the biggest, best looking garlic. I give it away. I sell it. I've been totally garlic self-sufficient for years because of this kind of a system. And my garlic just grows wild in an edible meadow. And I have enough garlic to eat and sell without ever planting garlic. And then the bulbils will produce smaller garlics in the first year. I don't harvest those. I let those come back for the next year. And I only ever harvest the big second year bulbs. I thin them out and eat green garlic so I can get some nice spacings to size them up better. And then, of course, it's planted in here with Monarda, another mint, of course. It's a great fork kind of repellent plant to grasses. There's mint in here. There's salsify in here, which is a great root crop vegetable again. So tons of there's really like 30 species. You can read all about this in Beauty and Abundance. There's a whole section on my edible meadow system. And then, of course, I can slash mulch it. I can take some small areas of this edible meadow. I can chop and drop them and make a big mulch pile. And then I can plant right into that mulch pile with my 3 sisters type of, is what I usually do. Or you can use potatoes and put potatoes in there. And then you have a whole field system that's growing Three Sisters, by the way, my Three Sisters garden in this area was as productive as an industrial cornfield. So I got as much yield of just the corn from it. Plus, I also got all this garlic out of the same place, plus beans and squash, and plus salsify, and what else did we talk about? Camas earlier. Camas is a great plant in a system like this. Breadroot is a great system like this. So this kind of a system could just be filled with cool, edible things. If Sandy, if you're looking through the book, you can tell us what page that's on.
Trying to find it.
Okay.
Give me a hint as to what the title of that is.
It would be in the back of the book, in the edible ecosystem, edible guilds, in the guild section. And
Is
there
it
should be
the edible aesthetic meadow guild that keeps the neighbors happy?
Yes, that's what it is.
Okay, so that's starts on page 409.
I just give an idea. So this is again what that slash mulch looks like when you're doing it. Chop and drop an area, plant into it, and that's it. Then it requires no more weeding or tending for the rest of the season.
Got another question.
Please.
I know that you like to do things research-based, but I understand that a lot of the science behind allelopathic claims is not really borne out in soil systems. Do you have a collection of the studies on the allelopathy of the mints and the bulbs?
There is definitely a research basis for those. Yeah, and this is a good thing to bring up too. It's the same thing with companion plantings. A lot of times with the older kind of idea about polycultures was to do companion planting. We were really excited about companion planting. I was really excited about companion planting like 15 years ago. And then we've gotten more and more research back. And what we've learned is most of the time, companion planting does not beat out just any random biodiversity. There are some specific places, like marigolds really do attract beneficial nematodes that kill bad nematodes. So that's one example. Now, if you have a nematode problem in your garden, then marigolds might help with that. But otherwise, the marigolds don't really do much other than what any other random biodiversity was. So on average, just if you take a book on companion plantings and you copy that versus just taking random plants that also work together and fit together without out competing each other and build guilds around that, they will work just as well as the specific companion plantings. So companion planting is still rad because it's a way that we can add biodiversity, because adding biodiversity does help the garden. And it's true, most claims on allelopathy, but we're making it something very specific here. Claims on allelopathy harming productivity of plants have not been backed up by the scientific research and scientific literature. But we do have a very robust and much more robust, very robust literature of studies that show that plant allelopathy does exist and is very powerful in a couple of ways. One, root systems. So there's a ton of stuff on mints, on mustards in particular, on mints, mustards, fennel, and sunflowers in particular. Those have all been studied really well, and there are studies out there on all of those, and they show that the allelopathy retards root development, which makes perfect sense. This is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about, and we literally can see it happening with our own eyes. We can see that lines of plants like this actually repel grass roots in real ecosystem and control the shape of plant communities. So not only do, and then the other thing that we have is that allelopathy also stops seed germination. For example, mustards are very potent with that, and fennel is very potent with that. So we can use those kinds of ideas too to stop germination of weeds in our gardens. Now, so there's a great example, fennel. It was thought for a long time that fennel hates everything, right? Fennel's the classic poor companion plant, the agonist plant of everything. But now we have a bunch of studies showing that, like with tomatoes, if you let the fennel outshade tomatoes, the fennel hurts the tomatoes. But if it's arranged so that the fennel is in equal proximity to tomatoes, there's a study about this, but the fennel is not outshading the tomatoes, then the fennel does not harm the tomato growth or productivity at all. But where it comes up to the fennel, it will retard the root growth and stop the root growth. The roots from the tomatoes will not invade the fennel zone. And the fennel allelopathy will stop the germination of tomatoes as well. Science is cool.
I think this just your answer there helped me understand a point that I hear left out a lot, which is they're not necessarily like across the board impacting all plants. It's selective. So it's like mints can stay, but tomatoes have to go, or whatever that is. So it's very plant specific. So you gotta I would really like to see those studies. So I can hunt for them, but if you already have them, I would love just a direct pointer to save me that time too. Yes.
I bet that I've posted them in the Facebook research-based permaculture group. Check that out. I bet I bet they're there. I may not have, but if not, too, in the next few days, I'll try to find them as I'm going back all through this stuff. So yeah, and to follow up that point, that's exactly it. We're trying to figure out in some ways what works and what doesn't. To me, the big concept here is this guild matrix idea. You find 3 or 4 plants that work really well together and that gel, and those can make up amazing kind of backdrop for an edible ecosystem. The one that we're looking at here, I call Strawberry Fields Forever. See this big picture? This is like 30 acres right here. Underneath, you can tell there's sparse grasses. Yeah, this is in northern Michigan. I've seen a few places like this in northern Michigan, by the way. This is sparse grasses through here. And underneath all of those grasses is just like a carpet of wild strawberries. Wild strawberries can be really hit or miss by the population. They can be really small and depending on the soil and very bland. This one has decent size. I'm not going to say they're huge. They're not like grocery store, farmers market strawberries, but they're definitely like, if I gave you a bowl full of them, you'd be excited. And they're really got just great flavor, and it's just solid strawberries under there as far as you could see. And the first picture on the right, the top right picture, shows American field mint. There's also a lot of field mint growing all through here as well. So here we have a big edible ecosystem with mint strawberries. And the second picture are areas filled with ground cherries. So, and these are really nice quality ground cherries too. They don't get as big as they do in my garden, but ground cherries are always awesome. And so a native plant also that's growing wild in the region. And there's also pretty stunted, pretty small. There's also Monarda fistulosa growing in here, which I can use as an oregano substitute or an herb and make tea. It's a great plant to have around. So this is a big edible ecosystem with sparse grasses, and underneath it, it's just filled with mint, strawberries, Monarda, and ground cherries reseeding all the time. Oh, and one more, sorrel. It has a bunch of sheep sorrel growing all through here too. And while I was visiting with the homeowner here, we made a big salad of mint and chopped Monarda, and a big salad of these sorrel greens, because it's a lovely lemony flavored spinach with a great texture, just as far as the eye can see. Now, I'm told these strawberries have been growing in this field like this for 50 years since this homeowner's family moved here. She had been here since she was a little kid, and for 50 years it had been like this. And the only management they had given it was that they would try to come up and mow it every once in a while, but it was probably only mown once every few years. So this is a long-term, stable, edible ecosystem. And the trees are very slowly advancing. You know, the forest is coming into the field very slowly, but it's happening very slowly. So this is another amazing model. So I took this model home too, and it worked just as well at Lily House as it did here with these strawberry fields forever. Have to kind of copy it. It won't work every place. But if we can try to recreate some of those situations, have a system like this. Yeah, Robin?
Yeah. What's the grass that is in there? Did you know what that was?
I did not, I can't remember if I identified the specific grass. It looked like it was a few different grasses. I think the grasses were, you know, I don't want to say because I can't remember what they were. I know that I did try to identify the grasses because I was really interested in that. I'd have to look back at my notes to see if I came up with a specific identification. There were two dominant grass species through there.
Does anyone have experience with the kind of strawberries that we grow, kind of not the non-wild strawberries, acting as a fortress plant? Because I can kind of imagine that, but I have never seen it. Well, I did, we had a community garden where somebody gave me a whole bunch of strawberries and I planted them all over the place, and they just kind of took over the whole place.
Yeah, I've actually visited a bunch of gardens where I just consider these like super voodoo magical gardens. Sorry, I wanted blue for a forest edge. And then of course this green area again, this is same thing we were talking about earlier, right? And then you'll have a green area that has, come on. And then we'll have, you know, some like shrubby and patches of more foresty type plants coming out into it. And then of course we have grassland, right? So this is a really super common thing in Michigan. All of the sites that I've seen that were really great strawberry patches, the grass, its life cycle strategy does not seem to have any kind of allelopathy or repellent quality to grasses. It can exist in these situations where the grasses are already sparse because of other plants. Usually my experience is that all the grasses, including the wild grasses, will get their strawberries. All the strawberries, wild strawberries, cultivated strawberries, will get their butts kicked by grasses, usually, and eventually over time, they will stop coming back. But what I've seen, here, we're gonna use red for strawberries. So here inside the woods, the strawberries, now, because past the blue, there's no more grasses. This is the niche where strawberries love to thrive. So now we're beyond that forest edge, tons of strawberries just growing wild, but it's too shady to get much fruit. Maybe you'll occasionally see one or two strawberries in there, but unless there's something that happens to like a tree falls and you get more sun, those strawberries will produce very, very little fruit. But strawberries seem to have, this is not science, this is Mike's observation. I've never read anything about this. This is just my observation from sites like this. I would hypothesize that their whole life cycle strategy is to hang out here. They're like us humans. We're forest edge species, probably. Strawberries are forest edge species. They hang out in here just on the other side of that forest edge where they can form colonies of a ground cover. Then strawberries send out runners really well, right? So then they send out runners into the grassland area like this. And they always have a lifeline back to the shady area and in around these foresty plants, right? Where they can hang out and have freedom from the choking out of the grasses. And from there, they keep pressing out and put out these lines like this. Now they're out in an area where they're getting more sun. They're not being outcompeted by the grasses anymore because they have this lifeline getting nutrients back from the forest edge where they can have good soil contact. But now they're getting the amount of light they need to also fruit heavily. If you can find a situation like this, you can get strawberries to grow very wild over a long period of time without needing to refresh them. Because what's the saying is anyone can grow strawberries 1 year. The problem with strawberries is over a long period of time. They either get outcompeted by weeds or pests and disease issues come in. In a situation like this, they've got the home base back and they're in the forest where they're protected from those things. And then they send out the spies into the field where they can get enough sun to produce heavily. And that's why this strawberry patch has grown wild for 50 years when farmers say you can't, that anyone could grow strawberries for 1 year. The problem is growing strawberries over a long period of time. Nature has figured out how to do it. Of course, nature has figured out how to grow. Strawberries have figured out how to grow themselves for more than a year. So this is exactly the kind of system that I imitated myself. And my observation is that places like what Pamela are talking about, I visited a bunch of gardens where strawberries are essentially one of the natural ground covers in the garden, and they're super abundant, just filled with fruit. And the reason why is they usually have some connection to some shady areas where they can hang out without human intervention too much, and they send out runners into the garden, and there's enough density and enough management of the weeds and grasses that the strawberries can thrive there as a ground cover over a long period of time. It's imitating exactly this. This is exactly the kind of system that I've now tried to imitate at multiple spaces. Pamela mentions using higher quality strawberries to substitute out for the wild strawberries. Now, I have collected a couple of really good wild strawberries where I really like the fruit, they're high quality. But I've also done the same thing we talked about before, cram spacing. So what I did is I went out, I researched about 10 varieties of strawberries that people said were super aggressive ones. And then I planted 10 different varieties of strawberries into 10 different spaces like this and saw which ones made it, right? So that's cram spacing. I'm letting nature roll the dice. I'm giving nature the tools it needed and then hoping that a couple of my strawberry selections would form dense natural stands like this that play together really well, and it worked. One of the best for me has been TriStar. And if you can get a Jewel is a really good one as well. Those two were very aggressive in some of my gardens and really great flavored. TriStar is great because it's an ever-bearing strawberry too. Boy, I went on for a long time about this, but this is just such a great lesson on imitating nature and how nature is the best teacher for exactly this kind of thing. You know, Pamela asked you a great question. Nature already had the answer. Okay, well, I've been talking about a lot of this stuff for a long time here. I just want to give you one kind of last example here. And that's the very first one that I ever found. When I had kind of that same insight that Bill Molson had, I had been working on a farm, on a CSA farm, and I had spent the morning, I swear, I had spent the morning weeding and pruning cane fruit. And it was a hard job. My fingers were all full of holes from handling them. And then I went on a bike ride afterwards with some friends at this bike trail. And along the side of the bike trail, there were black raspberries were in season. And these were just loaded with fruit. So we went home and we grabbed like 3 5-gallon buckets and filled up 3 5-gallon buckets. We might not have completely filled them up, but we just, basically nearly filled up these buckets with black raspberries. And there were other people there also harvesting black raspberries. And I was thinking, I'm doing this wrong. I spent the whole morning like weeding a blackberry patch or raspberry patch, pruning them, getting my hands all full of stuff, fertilizing them, putting compost in there. And here was a stand that was super productive, and nobody was tending this except maybe the deer pooping on it and peeing on it after they get a bite. And it's like, wow. And I went back to the same place and all season long and foraged blackberries, and there was asparagus there. There were wild strawberries here too. There were autumn olives here. There were all sorts of nuts, hickory nuts, black walnuts through here. There were wild grapes growing through here, elderberries growing through here, milkweed growing through here. Those grasses that I talked about experimenting with, those came from here because this is my favorite foraging spot. There was stuff all season long, a whole season. There were some wild alliums through here. It was a whole season of edible abundance that nobody was doing any maintenance on at all. And so I took that home and I imitated and studied those plant spacings and the distributions of things. I imitated it well, and that became that mighty hedgerow at Lily House. And guess what? It worked just as well there as it did at in the wild space. So, and that is what really changed my entire gardening, seeing the success of that and seeing these other natural teachers. My whole gardening became a thing where like 90% of my landscape now, in any place I go, if it's more than a tiny, tiny garden, if it's a tiny, tiny garden, it's mine. I'm planting it out intensively. If I've got anything more than that, I try to think in guilds, in relatively stable plant systems with a guild matrix that's highly useful to me. They'll be stable and very useful over a long period of time. If I can do that, then I have really surrounded myself with that kind of natural abundance that will thrive without much intervention over a long period of time. To me, that's like the dream, right? If I can grow a garden of guilds that mostly take care of myself, with a little bit of light tweaking from me, then I get tons of food for very little work. Magic.
This is, can I talk about a couple of my observations related to this?
Yeah.
So I'm teaching foraging classes, and I've actually started telling my students how they can manage the berry patches that they're harvesting from wild, because in visiting them myself over many years, I find that all the dead canes that no one's proving make it really hard to get to the fruit that may still be fruiting prolifically, but like there's so much stuff in my way. And it also provides more body for like vines and other weeds to grow up and climb up and strangle and get in my way basically when I'm trying to harvest. And then so I don't love that part about the wild ones. And also they can get too dense just with brambles themselves, but also my friend and I both lost our best berry patches this year. Mine got shaded out. I don't remember what he said happened to his, but how long how long did your system last in this state that you had seen? Because what we're seeing when we go to these, well, you have mentioned it, you've been discussing how some of these are lasting 10 years, but a lot of them I think change pretty rapidly out in the wild.
Yeah, it depends. There might be a cycle where when something's been clear cut, succession happens. So what I love to look for is what I call incidental maintenance. And so I would even call this, the principle of incidental maintenance, by the way. So there's some things that we can do or that happen that hold up succession and install succession in place. And some of those don't require us doing any work. But I first want to reinforce your statement that yes, with some very light tweaking, we can improve these kinds of systems. And so what I teach people, these are blackberry canes or black raspberry canes. It could be either, right? So this is the kind of the pruning that I teach for this kind of a system, by the way. So this is once they get up to about stomach high or chest high height, what we all know, you've seen this, black raspberry canes will keep going forever, they'll keep going like that until they reach the ground again, and that's where it's going to root again. So we're going to have a bunch of these things, and they're all going to be like this, and they're all going to be, spreading out all over the place and making a mess, and they're really hard to manage. And sap runs vertically through plants. So, and the sap causes green growth. So these big long vines produce tons of green growth and very little fruit. So one, they're a big mess. They're hard to manage. They can get really dense. That can cause air infiltration issues. It can cause problems, pests and disease. Vines can crawl all over it like very sudden. So that can become a problem. So what, oh no, undo that. So what I do is a very, very simple, low intervention pruning system in wild, for wild systems like this, which is just once they get to that height, boom, I take my little clippers or my comma, and I take off the heads. And in fact, at this stage, I can even do it with my bare hands. You know, that tip is usually not too pokey. I can usually just pick that off with my thumbs. Now, what happens is I get, oops, instead, I get things that look like little palm trees with lots of laterals. Now, the laterals are horizontal and they tend to produce more fruiting spurs. These will now be covered with fruit, and there will not be contact with, they're not going to be tip rooting. Every place where that long vine hit the ground, it would tip root and produce new plants. So if I go through once a season and pop their heads off, and then maybe some of the laterals will start to get long and contact the ground. So it could be I come back for a second go and just prune off those two. Then I can keep this patch stable over a longer period of time. It's far more productive, and it's got much better air infiltration with that palm tree kind of shape. This is a much better berry patch, and it didn't require all of the labor I was doing on the farm, right? It's not that hard. It's not that much work. I'm just going through and one time going, chopping all their heads off. And so there are ways with all of these systems that we're not intervening a lot. They're very light interventions that can have a big impact on our yields. This makes it stable over a longer period of time. And next, I'm going to talk about the incidental maintenance. But first, I want to hear what Robin has to say.
I just actually had a question. I have that same problem this year, and I just haven't had time to kind of look into it. But I planted a whole bunch of black raspberries last year, and now this year they're growing and they're really huge and they're all bent over into these giant arches, and I don't have any fruit. So is it too late to lop them off, or can I still do that this year, or should I do it next spring, or what would be the best time to do that now that they're already really big?
If you want a bunch more plants, keep them, let them tip root, take all of those new plants and plant them out, right? So they're going to give you free plants. But if you want more fruit next year, so raspberries fruit on the second year canes. So if I lop off their heads this year, they're going to produce laterals. Next year, those laterals are going to be covered in amazing rich fruit, and they're going to be better quality fruit than if I just let them as long canes. But if I want a bunch more plants, I can let those canes get really long. And in fact, I can go through and bury those canes at every node, and each one of those nodes, I can, in fact, I've taken a cane that was long like that, and at the end of the season, or towards the end of the season, you can get like 20-foot long canes. Can lay that down, bury all those nodes along there, and you get like literally 30 plants for next year. So if you want a bunch of plants, do that. If you want a bunch of fruit next year, it's not too late to make that cut.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
It's better to do the cut as soon as you can, so that you're not stealing too much energy from the plant and setting it back too much. But it would be better to trim it than to not trim it. Same thing works with blackberries too. Yeah.
Can you go back when you showed a slide briefly that said that people said that this is more food in this little area than in my big 1,000-square-foot garden or something? I would just like to see that and hear more about what was in there.
It's exactly that edible aesthetic meadow guild that won't make your neighbors hate you.
Oh.
I think there are more pictures in that book that show it earlier in the season with lots of cool flowering things going on too.
Uh-huh.
But that's exactly what's in here. It is, I think even up front you can see some borage growing wild, and there is a seedling. Lots of garlic is a big part of it. Mints are a big part of it. And camas is a big part of it. There are spring bulbs, so it looks pretty, including daffodils. Walking onions are in there. Allium unifolium is one of my favorite edible perennial alliums. I love it to death. It's a great wild chive that loves to grow into grassland. That allium molly are a couple of my favorite alliums, but that allium unifolium is just the best. I did taste testings of all these different alliums like that, and most people in the taste test like allium unifolium more than chives and Chinese chives.
Really?
That Chinese chive or garlic chive is also great in a system like this. Scorzonera and salsify self-sowed in here. Radishes self-sowed in here. Fennel self-sows in here. And then I do chop and drop and plant my Three Sisters garden into there too. Oh, and Monarda, of course. Monarda is such a lovely plant. And milkweed. So I think that was most of it. It's off the top of my head, but those are a lot of them. If you want more details, they're in that chapter of the book.
Yes, and that's around page 410. So, okay, thank you.
Cool. Well, just to point out one last thing, we're talking about two big scientific concepts today. And one is the idea that labor in gardens in agricultural systems, follows the law of diminishing returns. So all smart traditional agricultural societies, all smart traditional horticultural societies, all knew this and developed agriculture based on this, that for an area of space. Oh, thank you, Alicia, for joining us. Yep, I think we've had a great talk today. We'll finish up soon. For all of these areas, for any size area of land, we can only get a certain amount of improvement of yield over time. Then once we put more and more time into it, we start to get diminishing levels of return. So most societies have kind of figured out a place where they're working maybe like 10 hours a week on agricultural productivity. What do you do with the rest of the space? You create systems like what we're doing. All traditional societies have systems that evolved with this kind of cooperation with nature. It's like we have some space for ourselves where we're doing agriculture, and we have wild edible systems with it. If we were smart, we designed our systems exactly the same way. In the upcoming classes, and maybe at the next First Church of Permaculture, we're going to talk about models like this around the world. Forest gardens in Nepal have done this. Even in Europe, European cottage gardens came out of an understanding that this was what Europeans did. We had small polyculture gardens, and then we used things like food forest and hedgerow systems to grow lots of food with very little work and very little labor. We can copy exactly this kind of thing. They're found all over the world. These are kinds of systems found in Japan. We can talk about the food forests of the Hunza Valley, which are apricot based and walnut based food forests. They're super productive on very little amounts of labor. They're working about 12 hours a week. We can talk about Kyrgyz apple walnut forests. Again, a semi-managed system where people are harvesting all these food from it with only maybe 12 hours or so a week talk about Spanish dehesas. We're going to get into those. And we have similar systems in the United States. There's systems called Strauss in Europe and in Germanic countries. They're exactly the same way because this is what we've always done as smart people. We figured out ways to work with nature and replicate wild edible ecosystems. When with modern agriculture, we unlearned that because we were just obsessed with big cornfields. But now it's time for us to relearn these systems that are a way of balancing nature, meeting our needs while still having space for biodiversity and other life. And it fixes our labor issue too. These systems are so much more productive per unit of labor. So in a way, this is kind of our big model going forward. The Sadayama systems of Japan are an amazing model. They're featured in a lot of Miyazaki's films, like Totoro. You can see these kinds of systems with these sort of wild, natural occurring food forests in the background. I have a Princess Mononoke t-shirt on today because of this. And so nature's the teacher. She's out there waiting for us to start being good students again. And we didn't get to this discussion of the balance with native plants today. We're going to have to make that our topic at our next Church of Permaculture on the second to last Sunday of the month. Oh, awesome. Totoro's my boy.
Yes. It's just a beautiful, all those movies are beautiful, but that is particularly beautiful.
They sure are. They sure are.
And
Ponyo.
Do you have links? of
Miyazaki
where-
was,
Do you have
I just want to say one thing. Miyazaki was very aware of these systems as a metaphor for balance with nature, with our right balance for nature, and also as a metaphor for our balance with the spirit world. Because it's as we move from human-controlled systems to these wild, semi-wild forests, that's where things become a little more mysterious, a little outside of our control. He was very aware that that's where magic was happening, right? And that's where these semi-natural wild systems were. Not necessarily off in pure deep forest, but at that intersection between us, our human world, and the wild world. Some really magical things happen.
At the
Yes.
edge.
Yes. And do people have links to where we can watch these movies?
I don't. I wish I did, because they're wonderful, wonderful movies.
I'll tell you what, I'll do a little research and I'll put that into the Facebook group, okay?
Great.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on for this wonderful discussion where we're making nature the teacher. And next time we'll have this discussion of the balance of native plants in these kinds of systems, because obviously our native ecosystems are super important as teachers for this. And also we may want to enrich them with some of our favorite foods, and that's okay too. It's that, again, that intersection between the human realm and the wild realm that becomes really interesting. So we'll talk about that at our next First Church of Permaculture. I hope you join me. I hope you had a great discussion today and you learned some stuff from it. I'll stick around for a little bit longer if anyone has any last questions. And it's a wonderful time to also sing the oldest song, as I always say, Euripides' Epitaph. As long as you live in love, let nothing trouble you. Life is only too short, and time takes its toll. Thanks.
Thank
Oh.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.